On April 15th of 2021, park rangers in Yellowstone made a horrifying discovery. But Yellowstone is not alone, because across America's national parks, rangers, archaeologists, and investigators have stumbled upon other terrifying discoveries. Things that defy explanation and challenge our understanding of reality itself. We'll begin with Yellowstone, and by the end of the video, you'll see why so many who work at these locations believe our national parks hold far more danger than the public realizes. You won't want to miss this one. On the afternoon of April 15th, 2021, a 40-year-old backcountry guy named Carl Mock slung his camera around his neck and stepped out of his vehicle near the Madison River, which is just north of West Yellowstone. For the past week, Carl had been coming out to this area regularly, fishing and photographing the wildlife. But instead of heading directly toward the Madison River, he began walking deeper into the wilderness, farther from the river access point. Maybe he followed a track or a sound only he could hear. We really don't know. We only know that he walked deeper into the trees. The attack was sudden and devastating. A massive male grizzly bear emerged from the forest and mauled Carl with terrifying violence. The bear left Carl with severe scalp and facial wounds that would have killed most people instantly, but somehow, despite the severity of his injuries, he managed to do something that would save his life. Carl had been carrying bear spray, and during the attack, he somehow managed to use it and it worked. The bear broke off its attack and moved away, leaving Carl alive but gravely wounded. He staggered back, and then he did the thing that most of us wouldn't. He found his phone and dialed 911. His voice was ragged but coherent, but finding Carl would prove to be much more difficult than anyone had anticipated. The rescue teams initially went to the wrong end of Baker's Hole campground, losing precious time as Carl struggled to keep conscious and from bleeding out. All the while, the bear circled not far away. For 49 minutes, Carl stayed on the phone, providing clearer details about his location. Finally, the rescue team had found him. He had collapsed against a tree, barely conscious but still alive, and the rescuers could see that the grizzly bear was still nearby and inching closer. But they worked quickly to extract him from the scene. However, due to the snow on the ground and the remote location, they had to transport him by sled to a place where they could access snowmobiles. An emergency helicopter had been called, but worsening weather forced it to abort the mission. Out of desperation to save him, Carl was loaded into an ambulance and driven 115 miles to Eastern Idaho Regional Medical Center in Idaho Falls. During the journey, the true severity of his injuries became clear. One of the bear's teeth had actually punctured his skull, causing severe head trauma and brain swelling. At the hospital, surgeons performed extensive operations and placed Carl in a medically induced coma. As doctors fought to save his life, wildlife authorities were dealing with the bear responsible for the attack. An interagency team of 7 people returned to the site on the following day to investigate. The bear remained near the attack site and even seemed unfazed by the investigation's attempt at driving it away with cracker shells and shouting. Suddenly, the grizzly bear burst out of the brush in a silent charge, head low and ears pinned back. The deep snow slowed its sprint just enough to give the 7-member team a few extra seconds to react. Realizing the bear was not bluffing but fully intent on attacking again, multiple officers opened fire. The charging bear was struck by several high-caliber rounds and collapsed about 20 yards from the human line. 2 days after the initial attack on Saturday, April 17, 2021, Carl suffered a stroke and was declared brain dead. In August of 2021, wildlife officials released their final report on the incident. DNA evidence would later confirm something strange about the bear that attacked Carl Mock. The bear's aggressive behavior seemed to fit a clear pattern, and it was defending something in the area. The 20-year-old grizzly had been guarding a moose carcass located about 50 yards from where the attack occurred. But when biologists examined the grizzly's stomach contents, they found something unexpected. In addition to moose hair, cartilage and meat, there was also bear flesh. The grizzly had apparently been in a violent fight with another bear over the moose shortly before encountering Carl. After all, the greater Yellowstone area is home to more than 700 grizzly bears, and with both bear populations and human activity increasing, encounters between the two have become more frequent. Since 2010, 8 people have been killed by grizzlies alone, and unfortunately, Carl probably trailed off to go take some wildlife photography, having no idea that it would be his very last. What do you think he was really after? Let me know in the comments below. He was a guide, a friend, and a man who found his home in these mountains. May his spirit rest in that wilderness that he loved so much. Rest in peace, Carl. Carl's story isn't the only terrifying discovery made in a national park. This next discovery comes from a man who years ago worked as a ranger in the southern United States who claimed something was living in the caves and was trying to lure him deeper into the darkness. On a cool October morning, Paul, a park ranger, grabbed his toolbox and headed down into the limestone caverns that made this park famous. It was a routine job, changing light bulbs, but it was one he never got comfortable with, because down there, alone in the dark, he always got the feeling he wasn't really alone. But this morning, his task was simple. He was to replace the burned out bulbs along the tourist path before the first tour group arrived at 10 in the morning. And the smell of damp limestone filled his nostrils as he made his way deeper into the cave. He'd been working at the park now for about 6 months, and he'd gotten used to the constant humidity, the way sounds kind of echoed strangely off the cave. Paul was about halfway through his maintenance routine, standing on a ladder near what they called the cathedral room, when he heard it for the first time. It sounded like feet slapping against wet stone, like someone walking barefoot through the puddles that formed in the lower sections. He paused, holding the new bulb in his hand, and he listened intently. The footsteps seemed to be coming from deeper in the cave, from an area that wasn't part of the tourist route. Paul knew he was supposed to be alone down here, and the park didn't open for another hour, and none of the other rangers had any reason to be in this particular cave so early. But he also knew that sounds in limestone caves could play tricks, so he just went back to changing the bulb, though he found himself working a little faster than before. Now, the footsteps, or whatever they were, continued for another minute or so and then stopped. Paul finished replacing the last few bulbs and made his way back to the surface. But folks, that was just the beginning. A few nights later, Paul was closing up the park's museum and gift shop. This was another one of his regular duties, to make sure all the lights were off, the cash register was locked, and the building was secure for the night. The museum was housed in a 2-story building that dated back to the 1800s, with all the creaky wooden floors and windows that rattled when the wind picked up. Paul had just finished locking the gift shop when he heard voices coming from upstairs, and it actually sounded like 2 people were having a conversation, though he couldn't make out the words. His first thoughts were that some visitors had somehow gotten locked in there when the museum closed an hour earlier, and it wouldn't be the first time people had wandered into an area they weren't supposed to. So Paul just called out and explained the park was closed and headed for the stairs. And the old wooden steps creaked under his weight as he climbed to the 2nd floor, but when he reached the top, the voices stopped, and the 2nd story was completely dark. He hadn't turned on any lights up here because he hadn't needed to. Thinking the entire thing strange, he felt along the wall for a light switch, and when he flipped it on, he found himself looking at an empty room. The 2nd floor of the museum was mostly used for storage and had a small balcony area where people could look out over the park. Paul methodically walked through the entire space, checking behind boxes and in the small office area, thinking someone was clearly playing tricks on him and hiding, but after extensive searching, there was nobody there. All the windows were closed and locked from the inside, and there was no other way out except the stairs he had just come up. As soon as he stood out there on the balcony trying to figure out what he'd heard, something hit the trees outside. And this wasn't like a bird or a small animal. This was heavy, like someone had thrown a large rock. And then he heard movement through the underbrush below, branches snapping and leaves rustling, and so he grabbed his flashlight and shined it down into the vegetation, but the beam could not penetrate the thick canopy of leaves. whatever was down there, if anything was down there, remained hidden. Paul then locked up the museum and headed back to his ranger station, which at this point was roughly about half a mile walk through the wilderness. The trails that connected the various buildings in the park were well maintained, but not exactly lit at night, so he had to use his flashlight to navigate. Fortunately, he was very familiar with the trail that led here to his station, and because of this, he never felt uncomfortable. But tonight, with all the things going on, he didn't feel right, like something was wrong, but he just couldn't put his finger on it. Now, about halfway to the station, he heard something that made him stop. And the only way he could describe it was this very soft kind of meow sound, like a cat, but electronic. Now, he recognized it immediately because it was the sound that his motion sensor made. He had actually bought it at a discount store months before. It was one of those novelty items designed to detect movement and alert you when someone was approaching. And it was even shaped like a cat, and instead of beeping, it obviously meowed. And so he had set it up at his ranger station as kind of a joke, but also as a way to know if anyone was snooping around when he wasn't there. But the problem was, his ranger station was still a quarter-mile away, and the sound wasn't coming from that direction. It was coming from the wilderness to his left. So he stood there perfectly still, not wanting to move a muscle, and he began slowly sweeping his flashlight beam through the trees, hoping to catch whoever this was, because someone had to be playing a prank on him, and he was hoping to catch them in the act. And then the meow came again, but this time from his right, and then behind him, and then in front of him, and it was now circling him. He just started walking again, faster now, and instead of this meowing sound being around him, it was now following him. Not constantly, but every 30 seconds or so, but from a different direction each time. By the time he had reached his station, he was practically jogging. He fumbled with his keys, got inside, and locked the door behind him. Now, the actual motion sensor was sitting right where he'd left it on the shelf, untouched. He didn't sleep well that night. Now remember that these are just single events in a series of strange events, because over the next few weeks, it continued to worsen. During the rainy season, parts of the cave system would actually flood, and those areas would be closed off to tourists. The water could get as deep as 10 feet in some chambers, turning them into underground lakes. Paul and the others knew to stay out of these areas because the water was cold, dark, and obviously dangerous. But one afternoon, while Paul was leading a tour group through one of the unflooded sections, he heard something that didn't make any sense. From one of the sealed-off flooded chambers came a voice he instantly recognized. It was his friend and coworker, a man named Marcus, and was calling for help, saying, "Paul, I'm stuck, the water's rising." Now, Paul had just explained to the tour group minutes before that the passages were all completely inaccessible because they were just filled with water. But now, here was his colleague's voice, clear as day, coming from the area, and Paul immediately looked back at everybody else, and he could see that their faces were all in shock too, some of them pale because they had heard it too. Thinking that his colleague was in trouble, he told the group to stay where they were and that he'd be right back. He went over, grabbed his flashlight, and headed toward the flooded section. The entrance was blocked off with a metal gate and warning signs, but Marcus's voice was coming from beyond it, from the darkness where the cave floor disappeared into water. Paul called back out to Marcus, but there was no response, and so he swept the light across the water surface, thinking that if he was in here and was drowning, surely he would see movement in the water or ripples, but the water surface was so calm. And Paul's not really sure what to think. He's just like, what? How is this possible? And then, from somewhere deeper in that flooded chamber came a single splash. And it wasn't like someone was struggling, it was like something sliding into the water. And he just instantly got this really bad feeling. And so he backed away from the gate, and when he returned to the tour group, he did his best to stay calm and told them that it must have been an echo from another part of the cave system, and he finished the tour as quickly as he could. But his hands were shaking as he led them back to the surface because things just were not adding up. Now, the moment the tour was over, he went straight to the visitor center and found the receptionist. It turns out that Marcus clocked out over an hour ago, and Paul simply couldn't explain the strange event that had just happened. But the worst was yet to come. You see, it wasn't until Paul talked to one of the senior rangers that he began to understand something was seriously wrong at this park. He'd finally worked up the courage to mention some of the strange things he'd been experiencing. Not all of it, just the voices in the museum and maybe the sounds coming in the caves. And he expected the ranger who'd worked at the park for nearly 20 years to either laugh at him or look concerned. Instead, he kind of just shrugged in response and told Paul to not worry about it, that it happens. After which, this unnamed senior ranger looked uncomfortable, like he'd said more than he meant to. It was clear that whatever was happening, other people knew about it, and they had been dealing with it for years, maybe even decades. It would turn out that Paul was not the first person to experience the deep strangeness. This ranger explained that what Paul had encountered was something the older staff had known about and didn't have a name for it, and they didn't understand what it was, but they knew it was there. Now, that conversation didn't end quite yet, but we'll get to that in a moment. But this is when everything changed for Paul, because he now began noticing things he'd overlooked before. There were certain caves or parts of the cave system that a lot of other rangers would not go into. And even stranger were the things people were finding in the surrounding woods, like empty baby carriages in the trees, 30 feet off the ground, clothing at the bottom of gulches, arranged almost ceremonially. A local man had swore he had seen a mermaid in one of the springs, though everyone wrote him off as crazy, and another insisted the devil himself lived in the caves and would sometimes call out to people in voices they recognized. Paul might have dismissed all of this as folklore, except for the things that were happening. Specifically, what had happened to him down in the museum basement. He'd gone down to the crawl space to get some weed whacker string, and the basement was original to the 1800s building. Cobblestone walls and a dirt floor. Stone columns ran the length of the space, and it was lit by a single string of bare bulbs. At the time, Paul had only been down there a few times, though he'd never liked it because there was something about the way the air felt. It was like thick and still, like it just hadn't moved in 100 years. At the time, he was busy untangling the weed whacker string when he heard the unmistakable sound, and he recognized that it came from deeper in the basement, from the darkness beyond the last light bulb. And immediately he froze, and so he called out, "Is someone down here?" But there was just silence. And then he heard the voice say, "Come back here." Now, everything about the voice sounded wrong to Paul. It sounded like human speech, but the way a crow might mimic human speech. The sounds were right, but the rhythm and cadence was off, like something that had learned words without understanding language. Paul spoke out again, asking, "What do you need?" though every instinct told him to run, and it just said, "Come back here," in the exact same way and inflection. Actually, it almost kind of reminded him of a recording, and so he just grabbed the weed whacker string and back towards the stairs, keeping his eye on the darkness at the far end of the basement. And even though he couldn't see anything moving or any shape or anything like that, he could feel that something was there and that he was being closely watched. He made it to the stairs, climbed them quickly, and shut the door and locked it. As it turns out, during the course of the conversation with the older Ranger Senior, remember, Paul learned that supposedly a supernatural being known as a mimic resided in the park and was responsible for all strange and mysterious voices heard. He gave Paul very simple advice: don't engage with it, don't follow it, and never ever go looking for it. And remember, this isn't just some fictitious story, this is a real eyewitness account by somebody who was a park ranger, which begs the question, whatever mysterious force that's lurking around these national parks remains a mystery. Our final terrifying discovery in a national park takes us to Mesa Verde in Colorado. Now, you'd think that when trained archaeologists unearth ancient human remains, it's a pretty straightforward process. They document their findings, they write their reports, and another small piece of the historical puzzle clicks into place. But the skeletons they found in a cliff dwelling there back in the 1890s didn't fit anywhere. In fact, the official explanation for what they were was so strange and unbelievable, for decades the discovery was treated more like a piece of forbidden folklore than fact. The evidence suggested that it wasn't a burial, it was a ritual to stop the dead from rising again. On a dry, sun-baked afternoon in the mid-1990s, an archaeologist named Brian Billman was on his hands and knees in southwestern Colorado doing what he'd done for weeks, gently scraping away at the past. The work at this remote site, called Cowboy Wash, was supposed to be straightforward. He and his team were there to map out the foundations of a small ancient village, catalog broken pottery, and piece together the quiet, everyday lives of the ancestral Puebloan people who had lived there almost 1,000 years ago. It was slow, methodical work, but as Billman carefully brushed dirt from the floor of an ancient pit house, he started to realize the story of Cowboy Wash wasn't what we thought. The first thing that felt wrong were the bones. Finding human remains wasn't unusual, but the Pueblo people had a very specific way of burying their dead, respectfully in a flexed fetal position outside of their homes. But the bones Billman was finding were inside the homes, scattered across the floors like discarded trash. His rational scientific mind immediately kicked in. Maybe there had been an earthquake that shook the burials loose, or maybe the village was abandoned so quickly that the people did not have time to perform the proper rituals. It was strange, but there were explanations. But then, his brush uncovered something that no earthquake could explain. The bones had marks on them, deep parallel gouges that looked like they'd been made by stone knives. Long bones like the femur and tibia had been cracked open down the middle, and lying right next to them was a complete stone toolkit. Hammerstones, sharp flakes, heavy-duty chopping tools. It was the exact set of implements you would use to butcher a deer or an elk. Billman was now convinced that he'd stumbled upon the site of a brutal massacre. The year 1150 was a desperate time in this region because a massive drought had crippled society, crops were failing, and violence between communities was common. So maybe raiders had attacked Cowboy Wash and in a final brutal insult had dismembered their enemies. It was a horrific thought, but it was a theory that fit a grim historical pattern. Billman and his team had begun working an explanation, but they found something that completely demolished everything they thought they knew. Inside one of the homes, lying in the ashes of the central fireplace, was a dried human coprolite. That's fossilized human feces. Someone had deliberately defecated in the hearth, the sacred center of the home. And it was so bizarre and out of place that Billman knew it had to be a clue. And so he sent the sample to a Dr. Richard Marlar, who's a molecular biologist, hoping it might reveal something about their diet. But when the results came back from the lab, the story of Cowboy Wash took a darker and more unbelievable turn. The sample had tested positive for a protein called human myoglobin, a protein that is only found in one place: human muscle tissue. Someone hadn't just been killed, they had been eaten. Now, that should have been the end of the mystery right there, but the team could now build a story around it. And around that same time, because of the terrible drought that pushed the people of the small village to the absolute brink, they assumed that in their final desperate days, they had resorted to the ultimate taboo of all society and culture, which is to survive. But if these people were starving, why was the village still full of supplies? Because they had found sealed jars of corn and beans and tools and perfectly good pottery all left behind. Starving people don't abandon food. In fact, bones showed what archaeologists call pot polish, which is the smooth, eerie sheen that forms on bones when it's stirred in a cooking pot for a long time. There were skull fragments that had burn patterns consistent with being roasted over a fire. With all this evidence, Billman and his team knew that they were looking at something far darker than a simple story of starvation. This was something else. This was a massacre. This was a ritual, maybe a brutal warning sent from one community to another. But they still believed it was a single, isolated event. And it turned out they were wrong about that too, because what they had uncovered wasn't a single page in a history book. It was a footnote in a vast, terrifying library of similar events stretching back for centuries. In Billman's quest for answers, he came across the work of a physical anthropologist named Christy Turner. Now, for years, Turner had been documenting a disturbing pattern across dozens of ancestral Puebloan sites. a pattern of human remains that all bore the same signature marks. The same marks that they had just found at Cowboy Wash. Turner's conclusion was staggering. He calculated that nearly 8% of all skeletons recovered from that time period showed signs of being cannibalized. Now, this wasn't a rare, desperate act. It was a consistent, widespread practice. And the deeper they looked, the worse things got. At a site in Utah called Rattlesnake Ruin, archaeologists found the remains of 20 people who had been butchered 100 years before the Cowboy Wash massacre. One of the skulls there had even been carved and shaped into a scoop. At another site called Sacred Ridge, they found a mass grave from the 9th century, 300 years before, where over 30 men, women, and children had been bludgeoned, chopped, and cooked in the same pattern, the same methods repeated over and over for hundreds of years across hundreds of miles. Archaeologists all across the Southwest were faced with a deeply disturbing discovery. For centuries, a dark tradition had been playing out across the landscape. People were being hunted, butchered, and consumed in a methodical, ritualistic way. But the question no one could answer was why? What could drive entire communities for all this time to do this? The first and most obvious theory was warfare, a brutal psychological terror tactic that maybe powerful groups from the canyon culture were using cannibalism to control smaller outlying villages like Cowboy Wash. But the problem with that theory is the level of processing on the bones suggested something more than just a terror tactic, which led to the second theory, witchcraft. Even today, some Pueblo cultures, the fear of witches, of evil sorcerers who bring drought, disease, and discord is very real. And the punishment for being identified as such can be brutal. In fact, in the year 1700, at a Hopi village, leaders accused an entire family of witchcraft and executed them. The historical accounts describe their bodies being bludgeoned and their heads smashed in a way that's very similar to the remains found at Sacred Ridge. But even that doesn't explain the sheer scale of it. 8% of the population is a lot, so could that many people have been accused of witchcraft? I mean, it seems unlikely. However, the story gets even stranger. Modern Pueblo people, the descendants of these ancient cultures, when asked about this, reject the term cannibalism. Their oral traditions are filled with stories of powerful sorcerers, of dark times, and monstrous beings who preyed on humans, beings that are often referred to as skinwalkers. What if the archaeologist and the Pueblo storytellers are describing the exact same thing, just in different languages? What if what we call cannibalism in the cold archaeological record is remembered in cultural memory as an encounter with literal beings? Today, thousands of tourists walk through the magnificent cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde National Park, imagining the lives of people who lived and vanished there. But few have any idea that just beyond the safety of the tour paths in places like Cowboy Wash, the Earth holds a much darker and more violent story. The honest answer is, we don't know, and we probably never will. And because you guys made it this far into the episode, I want you to all comment below, terrifying discovery. So that way I know who made it to the end of the episode and who didn't. And if you guys enjoy content like this, where we deep dive into strange cases of the mysterious and supernatural, what are you waiting for? Smack that like and subscribe button right now for more content just like this. As always, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll see you all in the very next episode.